This is an incredible panel of people. You've heard their bios, but people I've known for a long time. Karl, Coletta, who's the vice president at night. We spent some time in Miami together. What a great thing for Miami at night. Karl gave me one of my first speaking jobs. I think you remember in Memphis, before I wrote anything like a Rise of the Creative Class. I've got to spend incredible time with Deputy Mayor Steele, and I've gotten to know him and his wife and incredible things they've done here. Mayor Dean, we celebrated his birthday in Nashville last week, and we had a great time. We got to sing happy birthday to him with Jack White, high point of my life. He has the record. And I want to kick it off by Bruce. Bruce, I owe Bruce a lot of favors. I hope he remembers this. The first speaking event I did to kick off Rise of the Creative Class, you hosted at Brookings. I will never, and you supported the early research. I think you remember that I did with Gary Gates. And Bruce has defined this field. You know, we talk about cities coming back in the suburbs and innovation and pragmatism. Well, he wrote the book on it. So I wanted to kick off with Bruce because we've heard a lot about this. But when you talk about the Metro Revolution, not just even in the big picture, but you've gone to city after community, what do you see happening and unfolding now and for the future? And how can we make this happen?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Rich, and it's great to be here. And, you know, the thesis of this book with Jennifer Bradley, I think, is quite simple. Everyone in this room knows we face big challenges as cities, as metros, as a country, jobs, poverty, climate. We also know, to build on Mayor Bloomberg, the federal government has literally left the building, not just figuratively, right? So what's happening, and this is the good news, cities and metropolitan areas, they're stepping up and they're doing the hard work to grow jobs, make their economies more prosperous, grow in more resilient ways. We talk about investing in infrastructure. Mayor Villaraigosa is here. Mayor Hancock is here in Denver with more local resources. We talk about what the mayor and Bob and Mayor Nutter have done in Philadelphia with really growing a new institutional platform for innovation. Recognizing manufacturing as a priority again. We have the mayors of Louisville and Lexington here. I can go on and on and on about skilling people for the jobs they can compete for, integrating immigrants as in Houston, preparing small businesses for the global market. What's happening is cities and metros are finding their networks, right? Elected officials for sure, government officials for sure, but corporate, civic, philanthropy, labor, civic, they're coming together. And each individually is powerful, but when they come together, they can do grand things together in the absence of federal or state leadership. And the second thing that they're doing is recognizing the top 100 metros. They are the engines of our economy. They are the centers of trade and investment. They are on the front lines of demographic transformation. I mean, we are talking 75, 80, 85, 90% of the national share of skilled workers, infrastructure to move people, goods, ideas. Innovation, whether it's patent intensity or advanced industry, that's what's located in our top 100 cities and metros. So our cities have been the economic powers. They are now the vanguard of policy innovation and social progress. This is a structural shift in the United States. There is no going back. And I think what we really have to do as city leaders and allies is figure out how to codify, how to capture, how to catalyze, and bring this forward.
And I think that's where I want to go next. I mean, I become a believer in the Bloomberg way from sitting on the mayor's challenge, which is create things that are scalable and replicable, and create things that work. And you know, the dirty little secret that we all know in economic development. How did you do economic development 20 years ago? You bribed a company. You gave a tax incentive, infrastructure, you bribed the company. But we now know we have to do things differently. But Bob, I wanted you to talk a little bit about what's happened in New York and in your role as kind of leading the economic development thrust, how you see economic development changing not only here, but other cities and communities around the country, what they can learn.
Well, thank you. I guess really that let's try to unpack this together. I think as Richard and Bruce have reported, cities have a good hand to play. People want to be in cities, so we have a good strategy. And from the mayor's perspective, I think we think that there are clear metrics to see how we're doing. And the simple ones are today we have record population, record jobs, record tourists, and record students. So people want to live, work, visit, and study here in New York. So that's the drumbeat of that we're getting some things right. But I think the mayor's basic strategy has been one of diversifying our economy and then recognizing change. So let me take a sec on each of those. Diversifying, what he's tried to do is to have strategies that move the growth over all 5 boroughs throughout the whole city. And second of all, with regard to industries, recognizing that we need to imagine the future And to be honest, it's different than the past. In this country, we had 300 years of an agrarian economy. We had about several hundred years of an industrial economy, and we're in the first few years of a knowledge and information economy. So how do we collect the right ingredients for us to be successful? And it really is for several reasons. We want startup companies, but we also have to recognize that our existing industries are being disrupted by this. And so the mayor's push to recognize that advertising, communication, publishing, all these industries are going to be changed. They won't be the same as they were, so the mayor's continually pushed that what are the ingredients we need for the future, and that was the genesis of his idea that education, science, engineering, and I think the last thing I'd want to mention too is something that Richard has written about, is that we need to have people want to be here. And this has to be a city where young people can come and the creative people that can create this future want to be. And that's a key driver of the mayor's strategy.
Thank you. You know, and New York is a great example, and we live here part-time. I teach at NYU. We're starting a new project on this remaking of the New York economy following what you and Mayor Bloomberg have done. And it's a large, diverse place. I look at the leading industries, technology-backed, $2.5 billion in venture capital flowing in here a year, innovation, the transformation of the media businesses, the creative occupations. And New York's a winner. And the world is spiky, that's what I like to say. But it's really interesting when I met Mayor Dean. Nashville. Not as big a place nearly, probably a tenth of the size of the New York Metro, roughly. But I started to look at the numbers, because I'm a geek and I like numbers. I started to look at the numbers, and the first thing that struck me, music industry. As big relative basis as New York or LA or bigger. Then I start unpacking healthcare success, transportation success. And when I went to visit the mayor, I flew into Smyrna Airport. What did I know Smyrna? You don't know. I wrote a book on Japanese investment in America a long time ago. One of the largest centers, 15% growth in manufacturing. So I want to ask you, Mayor, in Nashville, how did you see these pieces? You know, most smaller economies are specialized. They might have one industry, but Nashville might not have the size or scale of New York, but it's a diversified place. How have you seen that, and what efforts do you think other smaller, mid-sized metros and communities can learn?
Well, Nashville certainly has benefited from having a very diverse economy. The number one employer in the private sector would be healthcare management specifically, which is kind of a demand area with healthcare reform. Everybody's looking for ways to save money and to run companies and run hospitals better, and that's sort of Nashville's strength. Hospital Corporation of America is located there, and it has a huge entrepreneurial spirit. If you look at the HCA family tree and all the companies that have spawned off HCA and created about 250 healthcare companies in Middle Tennessee, it's very impressive. Then, of course, hospitality is big for us. That ties into the music industry, it ties into our history and sort of the natural beauty of Tennessee, but hospitality is vitally important. Another area that Nashville's strong on that we really should talk about more than we do is universities. You know, it helps us a tremendous amount to have a world-class university like Vanderbilt there. And then particularly in the last 7 or 8 years, you've seen schools like Lipscomb and Belmont really come on strong as national players, and you have MTSU and Murfreesboro and other schools. So there's always new people coming in. There's always a lot of energy. And you mentioned the music industry. The music industry would not necessarily the biggest industry in the city, but of course it gives us our identity. It's got an incredible amount of entrepreneurial spirit and strength. It's great for branding and for bringing people to the city. And as you mentioned, you know, the depth of the music industry in Nashville and the number of people who are employed in it is the greatest in any city in North America. I mean, it's very, very strong. So I think the diversity of our economy has really positioned us well as we come out of the recession. And you can't underestimate the importance of having a diverse economy.
And Carol, you know, Mayor Steele was very kind. He said, I drew attention to this issue of talent and great places to live. But the actual person who drew attention to this, who taught me about that, is Carol. I mean, that's what, 15 years ago, she was the first person who was talking to me when she was in Memphis about how do we attract talent, what is talent, pushing me, how do you measure it? And you've been on the ground for all of those years doing it. When we talk about quality of life, or what we've come to know, quality of place, that's what Deputy Mayor, when we talk about quality of place, livability, how is that changed, and how is that becoming more important in our discussions about how to build great and thriving communities?
Well, I think the good news is it's now, first of all, talent is recognized as an economic issue, which is which was the first hurdle, right? And the second one, I think, is now there's a recognition that quality of place is essential to the attraction and retention of talent. So, and as a and it also underpins innovation in a lot of ways. I mean, this, the happy accidents, the collisions that you want to occur in your city. So I think that now that has become, that's less mainstream, I think, in the economic development discussion than talent around the country. Right. But it is beginning to enter the idea stream in terms of economic development.
And for folks in the audience, when we came to this, and it's just, everyone talked about, it was about companies. And that's important. Companies do drive the economy, but no one was talking about people. And I remember I asked I kind of started to ask students where they wanted to live and work, and they started to tell me, because I want to live in a great city. I want to live in a great city that has a thriving labor market, more than one job. And this idea, and economists have now proved it, that actually it's not just firms that generate innovation, it's this human capital quotient, that places have more of it. But Deputy Mayor Steele and I were talking a couple weeks ago, and we had a discussion around breakfast again today about this is all happening, but what's happening, unfortunately, in our cities is we're starting to have this divide, right? And we were talking about, in a knowledge economy, in a post-industrial economy, you and I were talking about that, Bob, how do we create these new pathways to get more people involved in this knowledge economy? And I kick it to you, but anyone else, I think our next strategy for economic development has to broaden it, so that we can get more people participating in groups that are currently feel like they're not part of this knowledge economy more on board.
Yeah, let me just go back for 1 second and comment on something that you and Karl said, and then I'll speak to this. I think that when I began my career and thought about financial services, you chose whether you were going to live in New York, Chicago, maybe Boston or Los Angeles, and that was where you needed to be to have a rich experience with your career. That's not true. New York today competes with Boulder, Portland, Seattle, Austin. These are the places we compete with, and it's actually been good for cities because we had to raise our game. And whether it's arts, parks, quality of water, these kinds of things now, we have to have a game that competes with them, because you can have a rich life living in these other places, and that's different than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And I think we've benefited from having that bar. I think, Richard, the question you asked before my diversion was, is I think really one of the knotty ones, and it goes to the issue of skills. And the reality is, as I said, our view, as the mayor's promulgated, is that we're now in an information and knowledge economy. And it's not about education per se. That's the cornerstone, but it's how do we build the skills. And I think the other thing I've been trying to think about is that if you buy the idea that I think, if I remember back, it's the second derivative, it's the rate of change of the rate of change. And that's accelerating. So the idea that you were going to be trained and, like me, work at one place for 30 years, I think that's off. And instead, how are we going to continually get people the right skills to begin with, and then make sure they continually are refreshed so they can have a rich experience and contribute in a special way? And that's the big challenge, I think.
But just to note, I think, again, going back to place and how place underpins a lot of the good things. If you get place right, a lot of the other things happen. I think Raj Shetty's new work that shows that economic mobility is greater in places where there is economic integration, which again is a function of place, with, in simple terms, rich people, poor people living close together, because it opens up networks of opportunity. I think that's really important. So to me, that's another layer of place that we need to be thinking about.
I want to build on both these comments, because I think post-recession, cities are going back to fundamentals and trying to sort out really what drives what in the economy. Pre-recession, we all basically worshipped at the altar of consumption, right? In cities and states at the national level. Post-recession, we're beginning to go back and understand, you know what? Production matters, innovation matters, technology matters. It's really the STEAM economy, right? Science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics. And a large portion of that economy, which is probably about 25% of the American economy and drives everything else, can be filled and occupied with kids coming out of high school with technical skills, coming out of community colleges, or going through on-the-job training. So this sort of post-industrial economy that we bought pre-recession, where everyone had to be on a track to 4-year degrees, defies the kind of complex and diverse economy we really have in our cities. In some ways, we have to go back and understand vocational education, the P-Tech examples here, what we used to call shop, right? And we cannot stigmatize manufacturing. What we need is to really have a much more diverse, broad-based approach to education and skills.
You know this because we've talked about it. My own theory comes from going to factory floors.
Right.
And what I observed on the factory floor, my dad worked in a factory, and when I studied advanced manufacturing, I saw that it was, when I asked what R&D scientist, what engineer created that innovation, the people in the factory said no. The workers on the floor created that innovation, and that's the wellspring, tapping into everybody's knowledge, innovation, what I call creativity. But it's interesting, when I read the Music Council report for Nashville, which is a great piece of work, and I read about all the stimulation of the billions of dollars, there's something in there that says, and you mentioned it, the linkage, the multiplier effect to the hospitality and restaurant area. And I actually think, and I want to push a little on this, you know, I think the STEAM economy, and I call it the creative class, STEAM economy, knowledge economy, that's taking care of itself. People are doing pretty good. If you're in that economy, you're making 75, 80 grand, 6 figures a year. But the half of us in the service, and don't have a manufacturing job, you're okay. Right. But if you're the 50% of an American who's doing a service job, you're making 30 grand at best. And you pointed it out, there's a multiplier effect. And I think one of the things we've got to push on if we want to elevate is how do we make those hospitality jobs? How do we do for those kind of jobs, service workers, how do we upgrade those jobs and make them better? And I know you've thought about that a little in the case of Nashville.
Well, I mean, clearly, the great thing about hospitality jobs and service jobs, Nashville has had a real influx of immigrants, a lot of new people coming to Nashville, and there's a great quote, I think it was Jane Jacobs, who say cities, you know, make the middle class, create the middle class, and which I think is going on in Nashville, which is a really good thing. But I would go back to what I hear every time I meet with other mayors and every time I talk about the future of the city. I would start where I started when I first got elected, that the number one issue faced in Nashville, Tennessee, and probably every other major city is education. I mean, fundamentally, the way I look at it is that for us to be where we need to be, that when a young couple is deciding where they're going to live, and they're looking around all of Middle Tennessee, and they're looking around the Southeast and the rest of the country, that they pick Nashville, and that public education is a plus factor. We're not there. And then the same thing goes for business expansion and business relocations. You've got to have that be a plus factor. And so for Nashville, a challenge we have is we have a growing tech sector, particularly in the healthcare area, but we probably have at any given point 1,000 open jobs in the tech sector we don't fill. We can't fill naturally. And so we've worked with the chamber to go out and aggressively recruit people to come to Nashville, but we should be producing those folks in Nashville. We should be producing them through our public schools and through our universities. So education, again, it always comes back to this when you talk about cities. It is absolutely the key thing.
Sure. I know you've thought about this a lot, not only your current role, but in your previous role. How do you make communities not only more creative, but tap into that creativity from the educational system, from the artistic community, across the community? What do you think are the keys to linking that to the economic growth and prosperity?
Well, I think it's very hard. I mean, it's a question you've been asking for a long time. How do you make service jobs more valuable? And I don't think we've come up with a lot of good answers to that. I mean, they're particularly as you lose union jobs in the service sector. As you can think about the application of technology, right, to a service job to make it more valuable. But I think that's a tough one because, and then of course, as you add technology to a service job to make it more valuable, you get fewer service jobs. So you've been exploring it. What's your answer?
Yeah. Well, you know, I tell the same story. I tell the same story, and it's the story of my father. I tell lots of stories about my father. My father told me all the time. He had a 7th grade education. He worked in the factory in New Jersey, and he said, I had a terrible job. It took 9 of us to make a living wage. 9. You know, your grandfather, your grandmother, our 6 kids, and I came back from the war as if by magic, my job became a good job. We made manufacturing jobs good jobs. We undertook to make them pay more. We decided, capitalists decided they wanted to fly lean forward. We want to sell stuff. FDR said we got to make these jobs, we got to have a middle class, and I think it's the same thing. We have to do it. And I think, there's an interesting report that the Manhattan Borough President did on this tech economy in New York, where he said it can be spread. And I do think this idea of spreading the benefits, but we can't get into this either or. It's either innovation or. It's got to be innovation and it's got to be prosperity and Bruce, I know you've thought about this, particularly with manufacturing, but it's all part of the piece. It's making better jobs and a more unified economy for everybody.
And I think it's also recognizing that we are going through really one of the most disruptive periods, right? It's not just the recession, right? It's the, this morning in a separate session, we talked about the rise of emerging market companies, right? Particularly Chinese companies, the shale gas revolution in the United States, the reshoring of manufacturing, traditional manufacturing coming back with advanced techniques because large retailers are insourcing into the United States, demographic transformation. Whichever city can basically, first of all, understand what is your starting point. I mean, this is the great Dolly Parton quote. Find out who you are and do it on purpose, right? All right, I'm a great American philosopher. I'm going to make her a Brookings non-resident fellow when I get back. But I think what we've got to understand is how do we capture what are really volatile, disruptive forces for our own places with the understanding right up front, more productive, more innovative, more resilient, and more inclusive. And I think it gets back fundamentally to a broader understanding of education and skills and much, much greater engagement of the business community, right, in our educational system. This cannot be segmented, compartmentalized, teach to test. This has got to be a much more engaged process. I think we have models, and the great thing about the United States is you're not waiting for a federal government program to scale. The circuitry of innovation now cuts across cities. Something happens in Philadelphia, in a year and a half, it happens in Louisville, it happens in Nashville, or vice versa. So let's capture these forces and channel them for this broader purpose of inclusive growth. I think you can't do that for everyone, but we are talking about millions of jobs that pay better wages, better benefits that we need to go after.
But let me just say, I mean, we segued from service jobs to manufacturing jobs. You went there immediately, and so did you.
Well, manufacturing's both, though. It's services and...
Well, but if you look at the jobs that are predicted to be the fastest growing over the next 20 years, right, I think 6 or 7 of the top 10 categories do not pay a living wage.
Absolutely.
So what do we do? I mean, home health care workers, food workers, what do we do about those jobs? Those people, we're going to need a lot of those. If the predictions are right, we're going to need a lot of people. They're not going to make a living wage. And the federal government's going out of business, so then what? The cities are going to subsidize all of those people. I mean, it's a real predicament.
But Carol, I just, to start with the math, which is pretty harsh. We had 81 million people in poverty and near poverty in 2000. It jumped to 107 million in 2011. 1 decade, quantum leap, 26 million people. We've got to have a growth, a vision of a broader economy that begins to bring these numbers to the point where we could have the kind of impact what you were talking about in the service sector jobs. But my Lord, we just went through what we should all wake up every morning is that is about as big a shock that we have to now respond. So what we're describing on the STEAM side is not to settle, but it is to try to get some of these numbers into a manageable.
And I think that the rudiments of the new growth model, given what Mayor Bloomberg has done, Deputy Mayor Steele, Mayor Dean, and all other mayors, I think the rudiments of the growth model are in place.
Right.
It's focusing on human capital and skill accumulation. It's the connection to universities as drivers. It's what you've written about, the anchor institutions, the clustering effect. And I think we've done that. We've done that better than I would have imagined. I think and good education, safety. Mayor Dean talks about the importance of safety. We've made our cities, Mayor Bloomberg, cleaner, greener, safer. I mean, it's an incredible thing, and the rudiments of the growth model are in place. And I think the next step, and that's why we want to share this with all of you, is expanding that growth model. I think how do we expand that growth model so we can create a bigger middle? Because the politics of not doing that, I live in Toronto part-time. Trust me, I've watched the politics unravel in a city that you would have never thought could unravel as a backlash effect. So I think we're talking about expanding that growth model. And just in our morning breakfast session, we talked about city building, infrastructure, pipes, sustainability, smart cities as being a way to begin. So I wondered, Bruce or anyone, Carol, Deputy Mayor Steele, comments on how we might think about, we've done a lot of stuff right, what is the next step in our economic development?
I'll start, and others can chime in. I think that let's try to pull the threads, because I think this has been a bit moving around, that we have the reality, as Karl identified, that there have been a hollowing out of a lot of jobs. And my professional experience in the business world was that technology will do two things. It will reduce the number of jobs that you need. And number two, if you're doing exactly what you did today, yesterday, then you'll be paid less. So I think that the answer to that has to be that you have to raise the skill set of the workers, because the staying as you are, there'll be less jobs paying less if you don't change that. So I think that has to be it. I think the second thing is that someone said of the panelists that this is not about government alone. This has to be a collaboration. As Mayor Bloomberg said in his comments, it has to be a collaboration between government, business, and the not-for-profit sector, and really driving the education side. And education has to have all of those factors too. Education has to connect in with the corporates as to what skills are they going to need, and reimagining what the training can be as people get on this runway into their careers or further education. There really has to be a pretty dramatic change in the mindset to think about all these things.
Great. I think it's time for, a lot of people are sitting patiently, so and we want to be as inclusive as we can of all the talent in the audience. So I'd like to see if there's questions, comments, things you'd like the panel to address. And I know we have folks with microphones.
There's a hand up here.
Please.
I will wait for the microphone. I'm from India. No point for guessing that. I'm the National Technical Advisor to our largest federal program of cities in India. And first of all, I want to say congratulations to Mayor Bloomberg, Atlantic Cities, and the Aspen Institute for putting this together. But I must say, as I'm listening to this conversation, that this is completely not relevant for a country like India. The real tsunami of urbanization is not happening in America or in the developed world. We're adding millions of people every day to our cities, and we have multiples of the challenges you're talking about. Not just about innovation, but the fact that the plumbing by which our cities are structured and run are completely broken. We're asking our leadership, politically as well as otherwise, to fight this wave with both hands and their feet tied behind their back. And you're confronting every one of the challenges that you're going to be talking about over the next day and a half. So my question for the panel, given that it's focused specifically on economic development, is the nature and the structure of how our cities' economies are built in some of these countries is completely different. This is not about the knowledge economy. 80% of micro-entrepreneur enterprises in India, in a city like Bangalore, don't have access to bank accounts. And yet they're coming to the cities because that's where the future is. That's the only glimmer of hope. So what do we do about taking some of the lessons that you're talking about, and they're really good and valuable lessons, but moving them to countries where the real frontiers of urbanization are taking place?
That's why we're doing this. That's why we're here. This is the first step. And Bruce's shop at Brookings has collected the McKinsey folks who are here, have done an amazing amount of work. But we're going to build more infrastructure. We're going to build more cities in the next 50 years than we've built through all of human history. We're going to spend hundreds of trillions of dollars. And this is the first. Atlantic Cities and now CityLab are the first two attempts to build that infrastructure for learning, and to do it in a way that's scalable, replicable, and can be diffused. So this is our start point.
I mean, I think one thing, as we talk about global cities and what we share with each other, is the starting point on power and governance. The United States power is very diffused. If you go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, who built America? The cities built America, right? I mean, we didn't really have a national government of volume until 1933. So as we look outside the United States, what we have is a very variegated picture, really, of where power lies in the world. In some places, it is still tightly held by central governments or provincial governments and bureaucracies, and the civil society that we have here, this network that Bob was talking about, corporate, civic, philanthropy, does not exist at the same level. So I think the American model that I think is being invented in this century is very much about a ground-up power, ground-up leadership, affirmative, pragmatic vision, right? That, I think, is, as opposed to the topic or the particular growth model or the particular intervention, I mean, a lot of what I think we learn from the United States right now is that basic sort of takeaway of where does power lie? And we do have a default proposition here, as we see as the national government goes on a frolic and a detour.
Just like other comments, questions? Yep.
One here from John Schoen from NBCnews.com. It seems we have enormous resources for some of the problems you're describing in some cities, and others are starved for them. The high-tech cities, San Francisco, Boston. On the other hand, what young computer scientist is going to head for Detroit as opposed to Silicon Valley? How do we reallocate? How do we stop the polarization of those resources as people self-select for different environments?
I think it's a great question, and I think you mentioned Detroit. I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen happen in economic development in the United States, and hopefully this will diffuse worldwide, is the incredible power of this hackneyed phrase, public-private partnership. But the motor force for change in Detroit didn't come from the local government. It came from a coalition of nonprofits, and Bruce knows this better, nonprofits and philanthropists and new money entrepreneurs who said, we're going to rebuild our city. And what they're doing is incredible. When I look at the project in Las Vegas, talk about a city that was hard hit by the crisis that Tony Hsieh's leading, and trying to rebuild the downtown and provide affordable housing and build a core, that's coming from independent entrepreneurship. So I think people are going to opportunity, and obviously there's a lot of opportunity in New York and San Francisco, but they're pricey. It's really expensive. There's a lot of opportunity in Detroit and Las Vegas and New Orleans and Miami, and they're not as pricey. And that's happening. But we have to figure out how to export those models, learn from those models, make them replicable.
Yeah, well, you can't underestimate just the importance of the free market and people having the freedom to move where they want to go and the place that's appealing to them. And so I think you have cities' strengths are their ability to attract creative people, create energy, have new ideas, and create entrepreneurs. And you look at a city like Nashville, which I think has done well for the last few years, and it's not so much what the government did. I mean, we did a lot of spending on public safety, which we got results for. We did a lot of spending on infrastructure, such as water systems. We built some necessary buildings, and so on. But the real excitement in Nashville is not is created by the government. It's created by young entrepreneurs, 23% of the population being sole proprietors, people feeling that they can earn a living there and still have disposable income and a higher quality of life. And so that's why they come there. They don't come there because I've announced some program. They come there because and that's why the immigrants are coming to Nashville, because they see opportunity, they see the chance to live the American dream. And I think creating that atmosphere is the best thing a city can do. It's one that appeals to people because they think they can come there and succeed.
And what you're saying, and what Mayor Bloomberg's done here, what you've done, is you got to get the basics right. You can't go all advanced before you get the basics right. Your own emphasis on public safety, safe streets, good schools. And sometimes people want to draw a wedge. It's about high-tech, innovative, or it's the other. All that stuff goes together as an economic development model. And I wanted to ask Karl just another question, because you get to see stuff happening in a lot of cities. You go visit a lot of cities in your previous role, in your role in the Knight Foundation. If you had to pick an example or two that you've seen that seems to be working at building, a better economy, but building a better economy that's diffusing for more and more people, do you have one or two that you've focused on that you think are good, helpful?
Well, again, I think economic integration and economic mobility are real problems, I mean, in our cities. So unfortunately, I don't have any great models to cite. I do think it's interesting to see cities that 20 years ago we would have counted out that are coming back in big ways. And I was looking the other day at the change in college-educated 25 to 34-year-olds in core cities, meaning CBD and 3-mile radius, and you look at this all the time. I was looking last 5 years, and it's amazing, for instance, Philadelphia, which I think Mayor Nutter's here somewhere. There are, 65,000 new people in that demographic group over the last 5 years who've moved in the core city, which was once really considered probably ungovernable and unlivable. And so, and again, that's that great combination of anchor institutions, cooperating with the government, cooperating with bids, representing the property owners. I mean, it's been very interesting to see how services can be delivered in a way, and you create the foundation that draws people, and they now want to live there, and they are living there in amazing numbers.
And one of the things that's super heartening to me, because I track these numbers, is to look at the numbers on where startups are happening. And you know, startups, hearing Mayor, they were only going to happen in the suburbs, right? They were only going to be in office parks in the so-called Nerdistans. And to see the startup revolution in America coming, you know, to parts of lower Manhattan, and of course, but you know, moving back from Silicon Valley to San Francisco, companies going into Newark, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, where I lived for 20 years, what's happening with companies, and you know, Jane Jacobs, that old notion, that idea, new ideas require old buildings. That there's something in the air of cities and history that creates entrepreneurial enterprise. And I think what Carol said, so many cities, not only the big cities that we had counted for dead, are beginning to see, New Orleans, another, where Walter's from, all of this activity that's happening is really heartening. What do you think are some?
I guess I'd say the other example we have when I try to frame this in the New York lens and what you said, if you look at the last decade in Brooklyn, that here you have a top 10 city in the United States, that really the story is just gets better and better. And you know, there's a lot of wind in the sails, so you know, it looks good, but that's really a good example of where you've had any, and now Brooklyn is the place that lots of the new economy companies want to be. And if you look at the real estate success in Dumbo, and people have figured out creative class, mixed use success, people now take the ferry from Williamsburg down to Dumbo with their dog and bike and go to work and then enjoy lunch in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And this is just something that was unimaginable a decade ago.
And if you went back and unpacked that, you know, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think were key to setting Brooklyn on that path?
I think number one is public safety. That, as someone said the other day, I wish I'd thought of it, that the public safety success makes New York a bigger city. And so I think the other thing would be some very long-term decisions on real estate where developers made decisions to try to invest in Dumbo, which basically rebirthed it. And then if you lay down next to that this transportation, where you look now, we have under Mayor Bloomberg's leadership, we have all kinds of new methods of transportation, new systems. The ferry system, the bike system, these are brand new. They didn't exist a decade ago. And then the last kind of icing on the cake is really the parks and the quality of air and quality of life. And it goes back to something I tried to say earlier. What I just described is a lifestyle that competes with Portland, Seattle, and Boulder. And so you can be the same person and have that life here.
And I want to underscore what you said about transit and the decisions made in this city 100 years ago to build a city that could house 10 million or 20, Metro that could house 20 million people. Those transit corridors are what enabled, in addition to safety and education, schools and neighborhoods getting better, those transit corridors, that's where the booming is happening, how you can get access. And actually, you know, my parents had a suburban dream, right? They mentioned that. They wanted to leave Newark, which was poor, the Italian ghetto. They wanted to move to the suburbs. They got to North Arlington, 3 miles away. My dad had an Impala, and he drove to the factory. He had the dream. But now we have a new dream. And that's not just in New York and San Francisco and Washington, D.C. That's a dream that more and more people, they want to consume. You said that. Less consumption, more time for themselves, living smaller. And it's a new kind of dream that's empowering not just big cities, but cities of all shapes. I saw it in your city.
I'd say
neighborhood after neighborhood.
Mass transit is certainly a huge issue for Nashville. We're probably 10 years easily behind our competitive cities in transit, and we're going through the process now of trying to catch up, and it's difficult. I mean, certainly we benefited too in the last, I'd say, 10 years or so from more and more people wanting to be closer to the urban core, that whether it's transportation costs, whether it's sort of the amenities that have grown up around the city, that they want to participate in that. And so it's been easier to attract people into the core. But for us, ranking up there with education, but just slightly below education, would be the need for us to get transit moving in the right direction.
My parents refused to leave Brooklyn, so you can interpret a lot. Early adopters, first movers. But You know, this city's 8 million on the way to 9 million. There's only 2 metros that are bigger, right? LA, Chicago. So for most parts of the United States, transit infrastructure is a metropolitan proposition. And the story I would tell is the story of Denver. We have got to find a way for cities and counties and suburban municipalities to come together around those game-changing initiatives that can shape their economies for decades and generations. I think we're seeing that. But there are a series of interventions that are clearly going to be city. But for most parts of this country, and just think about the political impact of this, it will be metropolitan, the true geography of the economy, and the way in which we finally move beyond this partisan divide and ideological polarization. In Denver, they don't love each other at the metropolitan scale, but they will do things together to basically fuel their economy forward.
I think we have a question.
Okay, so far it's been kind of a U.S.-centric conversation, quite appropriately. But I know, Bruce, you've done some amazing work around the whole global cities idea. And speaking about cities being more successful, that have more global connections, and then would you speak to that, and then also talk about the role of immigration and our progress or lack thereof on immigration policy as fueling cities and their success?
I'll just talk real briefly, and then everyone else comes in. So Jane Jacobs, when she wrote her favorites book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, said the foundation of cities is trade, right? Because trade makes places rich and competitive and brings large numbers of people up the ladder. And so I think as we're looking around the world and seeing these emerging markets and rising cities, the U.S. needs to get out more, right? I mean, because we are the most demographically diverse and frankly the most demographically blessed country in the world, but we're very inward looking and we're very parochial and provincial in a lot of ways. So at Brookings, and obviously there are the people on both sides of me that have played this out, there is a fundamental need to understand what do we make, what services do we provide, including tourism, what do we trade and who do we trade with, and how do we begin to set up a network of trading cities, bilateral and multilateral, that powers the world forward. Because in a way we are going back. We really are going back to the Venetian period, the Hanseatic League, the Silk Road, all of that. And for each US city and metro, understanding that global engagement, global fluency is a path to inclusive growth is absolutely fundamental.
Just quickly, I mean, your point about trade and global cities and immigration, I mean, when we talk even about America, the one secret America had for economic growth wasn't a lot of resources, wasn't a big country, it wasn't a big market, it had open immigration before most other places figured this out. But what we're seeing now is a wave of immigration unlike we've ever seen, right? Doug Sanders, the cities of opportunity, not just all over the world. I mean, come to Toronto. I mean, you want to see Vancouver, you want to see a wave, Mexico City, waves, you know, India, the growing cities of the world, migration, some of it from the countryside, some from other, it's an amazing thing. And I really believe that mobility has to be a right.
I think,
mobility
Richard,
has to be a basic right.
You know, in New York City, the mayor's fond of saying that we have 40% of the people that live in New York are first-generation Americans, which is a huge asset. And as the mayor says, we live as a mixture, not as a mosaic. Someone earlier, I think it was Karl, was talking about the need for people to be proximate of all types of people, and I think New York gets pretty good grades on that. Second of all, the tourism is, we had 52 million tourists last year, a little more than that, and 20% of those people were from overseas. Now, the reason why that's important to us is the 20% accounted for 50% of the spend. So winning the overseas tourist was a valuable game. We also have, and that's about 320,000 jobs that tourism and hospitality provides for New York City. And so I think the other mindset last week too, I was just thinking, the mayor and I had two meetings that come to top of mind, one with an Indian service company and the other with a Chinese real estate developer who are wanting to come here. But we can all do better to be more connected. I like our cards in our hand, but we could surely play them better in trying to not give up on this at all and recognizing the importance of it.
And for small and medium-sized communities, attractiveness to immigration is a big differentiator. Of everything we've talked about, the ability to attract ambitious immigrants and open, from every small and medium-sized metro that's accomplished that, it's been an economic development growth driver because immigrants create jobs. They not only take jobs, they create jobs. I see one more question. I see a couple of questions. I don't know how good we're doing on time.
Good morning, Benjamin Barber from City University of New York. Thanks for this remarkable meeting, Mayor Bloomberg, and also this discussion. But I want to come back to our colleague from India and also the comment about the parochialism of some of our own discussions of cities, because we do live in a global world where the major cities are megacities, not New York and LA at 10, 12 million, but 20 and 30 million people. And those cities are growing so fast that issues of inequality and capitalism and mobility and labor, as our friend from India said, are profound. And I'm not sure how relevant this remarkably American discussion, and appropriate to America, and perhaps Europe as well, is to those cities. When I think about Mumbai, when I think about Rio, when I think about Jakarta, and when I think about Lagos, one wonders how much, if representatives for those cities were here, they would learn from this discussion. And I'd love to hear the members of the panel extend a little bit the compass and perhaps even address the dark side of our field is Mike Davis's planet of slums. That's a term that suggests, yes, cities are all over the place, and we're really talking about a world of slums. And how do we address, with all the privileges that we have in our cities and all of the extraordinary advances we've had under the leadership of mayors like Bloomberg and Nutter and Cory Booker and others, how do we address and help them address those problems? Thank you.
I mean, I think that, Ben, this is it, right? This is the big challenge. If we don't get the cities right, we don't deal with climate, we don't deal with youth unemployment, right, which leads to great social unrest. We don't deal with the major challenges of our time. So the question for US cities, right, is from both a market perspective, but also a placemaking governance perspective. What do we have to impart? What do we have to learn? It's not like we have all the answers here. I mean, the U.S. has been the land of bad habits for quite some time, right? But one of the stories we talk about in the book, Metropolitan Revolution, is the story of Portland. Weird and crunchy, right? And Portland, of one of the few cities and metros in the United States, made a bet going back 40 years. Urban growth boundary, tear down the freeway in the downtown, build transit, begin to have an interconnected metropolis, right? What happened, therefore, it wasn't really the initial plan, attracting environmental firms, make products, make services that are of great utility in some of the rising cities. The brand of Portland today is we build green cities. And their focus is on Asia, and their focus is on Latin America. So I think it gets back to this notion of, at a fundamental level, the city and metropolitan leadership in the United States need to be globally fluent, right? We need to be globally fluent for ourselves, right? Because that's how we will grow more productive and innovative, resilient economies. But we need to be more globally fluent so we can really engage with the world and with these rising cities. What we need, and I think your writing about this is really absolutely critical. We need new institutions, new kinds of intermediaries for this century. It's not the UN, it's not the existing post-war institutions. It's going to be new institutions that play this out.
And Ben has written the book on that, and Ben and I are going to have a conversation. It's the book title I most wish I had. I'm telling you, it's called If Mayors Rule the World. It is the best title I've ever heard. And Ben, we've crunched the numbers on this, and I like Mike Davis. I like a lot of my colleagues on the left, but I get up optimistic. The world is 56 years old. The world has been going to hell in a handbasket for all 56 years, and we seem to get better off. We looked at the numbers, and we used Bruce's data. We haven't published this yet on Metro global GDP. And we calculated numbers for the productivity of metros versus their country for the developed world, the emerging world, and the poor world. In the developed world, Silicon Valley has about 1.8 times the productivity of the United States at the outlier, or Midland, Texas, with a lot of oil. In the emerging world, you get ratios up to 5 and 10. Yeah, it's poor. Yes, there's distress. Yes, it has to be better. Yes, we have to do more. But if you can get yourself to a city, that engine that works, that Bruce and we've all talked about here, work so much better. I just want to say thank you to this great group of friends and panelists. Thank you to Mayor Bloomberg for getting us all together. Thanks to all of you for your energy. And this is the start of a conversation. It may be starting with America, but this is the start of a conversation about our world and our global cities. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for attending the opening preliminary session